8-year-old black boy stuns judge with his legal intelligence. The entire jury is shocked. The courthouse stood like a fortress of marble and glass, tall columns casting long shadows across the busy city street. Reporters crowded outside, cameras flashing, microphones pointed toward the heavy oak doors. Inside, the air buzzed with hushed whispers, the kind that hinted at something unusual, something extraordinary about to happen. At the center of the anticipation was a case that had gripped the entire city. But it wasn't just the case itself, it was who was sitting quietly on the front bench that drew everyone's attention. An 8-year-old black boy, his small legs barely reaching the floor, sat beside his mother. His posture was straight, his expression calm, almost unnervingly focused for a child his age. The courtroom audience shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered about how absurd it seemed that a boy so young was even present in a case this complicated. Others sneered, their voices laced with doubt and quiet prejudice. How could a child, especially a child from such a background, matter in a place ruled by law and order? The boy's mother kept her head down, clutching her worn handbag tightly, her knuckles white. Life had been cruel to her, and now the fate of her family teetered on the edge. She knew her son was gifted, but she also knew the world rarely recognized brilliance when it came wrapped in the skin of someone like him. At the far end of the courtroom, the jury settled into their seats. 12 ordinary citizens, summoned to judge not only the case but, unknowingly, to witness something that would shake the very foundation of their beliefs. The judge, a stern-faced man known for his impatience, adjusted his glasses and glanced toward the boy with a mix of irritation and curiosity. Then, the boy stood up. He wasn't supposed to. His mother tugged at his sleeve, urging him to sit down, but he gently pulled away. The courtroom fell silent, the shuffle of papers and coughs vanishing into a heavy stillness. Every eye turned toward him. No one expected what came next. The boy's voice, clear and unwavering, cut through the silence. He didn't stutter, didn't hesitate. He spoke about evidence, about inconsistencies in testimonies, about legal principles far beyond the grasp of most adults. His words weren't the rote recitation of something memorized. They were sharp, analytical, and startlingly insightful. He was not guessing. He was reasoning. Gasps filled the air. A juror leaned forward, eyes widening. The judge's pen slipped from his hand, clattering onto the bench. Lawyers turned their heads in disbelief, their carefully prepared arguments crumbling before the logic of an 8-year-old. What began as whispers in the back rows now grew into a low rumble of astonishment. This was no ordinary child. And yet, behind the shock and awe, tension simmered. For in that room were those who would not easily accept such brilliance. Some saw in the boy a threat, a disruption to the natural order they clung to. Others, however, felt a spark of hope, a possibility that the truth, long buried under prejudice and power, might finally come to light. But what no one knew, not even the boy himself, was that the case he had just disrupted would uncover secrets, darker and deeper than anyone in that courtroom had ever imagined. The jury was stunned, the judge rattled, the audience silenced. And the story of the 8-year-old black boy, who shook the very core of justice, had only just begun. The courtroom tried to steady itself after the boy's startling display. The judge cleared his throat, rapped his gavel once, and attempted to restore order. But the silence that followed was not one of routine. It was heavy, watchful, and tinged with disbelief. How could an 8-year-old articulate legal arguments so precise? The prosecution shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while the defense lawyer adjusted his tie nervously, suddenly unsure of the ground beneath him. The case at hand was complicated, a property dispute, entangled with fraudulent contracts, manipulated evidence, and accusations of financial exploitation. Most adults found the stack of paperwork incomprehensible. Yet here stood a child who had not only read through them but dissected their flaws with an insight that left seasoned professionals shaken. The boy pointed out how a witness statement contradicted itself. He identified how dates on certain documents didn't align, suggesting forgery. He even mentioned a clause buried in the legal code that neither lawyer had referenced. His small hand traced the logic across the courtroom, every word carrying the weight of truth. The audience, once skeptical, now leaned in, spellbound. And yet, the deeper he spoke, the more some faces hardened. The prosecutor's jaw clenched. Members of the gallery exchanged uneasy glances. To them, his brilliance was not just surprising, it was threatening. Because if a black boy of 8 years old could unravel lies in a courtroom, what else might he challenge in the world beyond? The judge tried to interrupt him, asking how he had learned such things. The boy simply answered that he liked reading law books from the library near his home. His mother worked long hours as a waitress, leaving him time to sit among dusty shelves and absorb the language of justice that so many took for granted. But as the boy continued, something else began to surface. The details he knew went beyond what a library could teach. He spoke of case precedents, obscure rulings, and technical strategies with the precision of someone who had studied actual trials. Lawyers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing phrases that mirrored professional arguments they themselves had once used. And then, without meaning to, the boy tugged at a thread that no one expected him to find. He mentioned a hidden connection between one of the property developers and a member of the jury. It was casual at first, an observation about repeated references to a company's name. But then he linked it to a transaction buried in the evidence, a payment that suggested collusion. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The juror in question stiffened, their face paling as if blood had drained away in an instant. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. This was no longer a child showing off intelligence. This was an exposure, a revelation that could unravel the very integrity of the trial. The prosecutor tried to object, but the damage was done. The jury exchanged uneasy glances. The defense lawyer clutched his papers, realizing that this boy had just detonated a truth that could change the verdict entirely. But while the courtroom drowned in shock, the boy stood calm, his expression unshaken. He was not trying to perform, not trying to impress. To him, the truth was simply the truth, and it demanded to be spoken, no matter how uncomfortable. His mother sat frozen, torn between fear and pride. She had always known her son was gifted, but she also knew that brilliance carried a price, especially when shown in places where power resisted change. And she was right to be afraid, because in that moment, behind the polished tables and beneath the judge's watchful eyes, the true battle began, not just for the case, but for the boy's right to be heard. Outside the courtroom, news of the prodigy spread like wildfire. Reporters were already drafting headlines. Crowds were gathering, and whispers of manipulation, corruption, and brilliance began to mix into one unstoppable storm. What no one knew was that the boy's discoveries were only scratching the surface. Buried deeper within the case lay a web of deceit tied to powerful names. Names that would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. The 8-year-old had shaken the courtroom. But soon, he would shake the entire system. The courtroom's air grew heavier with every breath, after the boy revealed the suspicious link between a juror and the property developer. The silence was suffocating. Everyone, judge, lawyers, spectators, looked as though they had stepped into a different world, one where the ordinary rules no longer applied. The juror in question shifted in their seat, eyes darting to the floor, cheeks flushed with panic. The boy, standing there with his small frame and calm expression, had done what no adult dared, peeled back the mask of respectability that shielded corruption. The judge rapped his gavel, demanding order, but his voice carried less authority than usual, because deep down, he too knew that the child had uncovered something real, something dangerous. Still, the boy was not finished. He placed his hand gently on the stack of documents again, scanning the pages as if each one spoke directly to him. His voice was steady, soft, but piercing as he continued to unravel the case. He pointed out a pattern of signatures on the contracts, subtle differences in ink pressure, uneven strokes, letters that did not match the handwriting samples in the file. To anyone else, these might have seemed like small details. To him, they screamed forgery. Gasps echoed through the gallery as he explained how at least 3 of the property agreements had likely been falsified. The prosecution's star evidence crumbled in real time. Lawyers who had spent months preparing their arguments now sat powerless, as a child dismantled them with surgical precision. But the boy wasn't only exposing mistakes. He was threading a narrative, piece by piece, connecting the false documents to shell companies, and the shell companies to powerful investors. Investors who weren't even supposed to be involved in this trial, yet whose fingerprints were all over the evidence. The veteran journalist seated in the back leaned forward, scribbling furiously in his notebook. This was no longer just a courtroom case. It was becoming a story of systemic corruption, of wealth and influence being protected at the expense of truth. Yet with every revelation, the atmosphere in the room shifted from or to unease. Because if the boy was right, then this wasn't just about property. It was about powerful figures, people outside this courtroom, whose names could shake the very foundation of the city. And power, when threatened, never stayed silent for long. The defense attorney wiped sweat from his brow. The prosecutor snapped, demanding the boy be silenced, claiming that an 8-year-old cannot possibly be a credible source of legal evidence. The judge hesitated, torn between his duty to maintain order and the undeniable clarity of the child's logic. But the jury could not unhear what had been said. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting to one another, each silently acknowledging the same terrifying truth. The boy was exposing something far greater than the case itself. The mother clutched the edge of the bench, her knuckles white, heart pounding. She had seen this coming from the moment her son first picked up law books, his eyes hungry for justice in ways children were never supposed to be. She had feared that his brilliance would draw unwanted attention. Now, as she watched men in suits whisper angrily at the prosecution's table, her fears became reality. For the first time, the boy faltered, not in his words, but in his gaze. His eyes flickered across the room, and he saw them, men in the back, standing stiffly, watching him too intently. Their suits were too sharp, their stares too cold. They weren't ordinary spectators. They were the kind of men sent when powerful people felt cornered. Still, the boy continued. He spoke of the law, of fairness, of truth. His words had a purity that no amount of corruption could erase. The audience leaned in, captivated by the surreal sight. An 8-year-old unraveling the lies of an entire system. And then, as if fate demanded one final twist before the day's end, the boy revealed a detail that silenced even the whispers. Hidden deep in the documents was a reference code, one that appeared meaningless to most. But the boy explained it was the tracking number of an earlier case, a lawsuit quietly buried years ago, a case involving the same developer, the same fraudulent practices, and a shocking cover-up. The courtroom froze. The judge's hand trembled on his gavel. The lawyers exchanged panicked looks. The juror accused of bias shifted violently in their chair, trying to mask their terror. The truth was no longer creeping out. It was flooding the room. And for the first time, the system itself felt afraid of an 8-year-old boy. The courtroom was no longer a place of law and order. It felt like a storm had been summoned, swirling between the marble pillars and the oak benches. The boy's quiet voice had turned into thunder, his revelations crackling like lightning across the walls. But storms are dangerous. They don't just cleanse. They destroy. The moment he connected the buried lawsuit to the current trial, everything shifted. The defense lawyers clutched their folders as though trying to protect themselves from an invisible assault. The prosecutor's voice rose, shrill and desperate, accusing the child of fabricating evidence, of being fed information by shadowy adults. Yet even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed panic. He knew the child wasn't lying. The judge, red-faced and trembling, banged his gavel over and over. Order in the court. He cried, but the words had no weight anymore, because for the first time, everyone inside the chamber realized the balance of power had tipped. The boy, just 8 years old, was no longer a passive figure. He was holding a mirror to the corruption that lay festering beneath the surface. The jurors whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others staring at the child as though they were witnessing something impossible. The accused juror who had been exposed sat rigid, hands clenched on their knees, as sweat dripped down their temple. Their once confident posture was gone, replaced by the look of someone cornered, trapped by the truth. And then it happened. The heavy doors of the courtroom swung open, slamming against the walls with a deafening bang. 2 men in dark suits entered, their movements crisp, their faces carved from stone. Their eyes didn't scan the room casually. They locked directly on the boy. The mother felt her chest seize. She had seen men like this before, men who didn't walk into a courtroom, unless they were there to control the narrative, to silence inconvenient voices. The spectators felt the chill too. Whispers rippled through the benches. The journalist in the back gripped his pen tighter, scribbling furiously, sensing that the trial had become more than a legal proceeding. It was now a battle between truth and power, and everyone inside was caught in the crossfire. The boy paused, his small fingers tightening around the papers he held. For the first time since he began speaking, his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. But then, like a candle refusing to be snuffed out, the fear gave way to resolve. He lifted his chin and spoke louder, his voice carrying across the entire chamber. He explained how the buried lawsuit had vanished from the public record, stripped, erased, hidden by clerical error. But in truth, it had been sealed under the authority of someone very high up, and the reference code he discovered was the breadcrumb that had survived, unnoticed until today. The judge froze. His gavel hovered midair, because the boy had not only unearthed fraud, he had revealed that the corruption reached into the very heart of the judicial system itself. That was when chaos erupted. The prosecutor shouted for the child to be removed, his voice breaking into hysteria. The defense scrambled to object, their voices clashing like swords. The audience erupted into gasps and cries. The two suited men strode down the aisle with purpose, their shoes striking the marble floor like war drums. The mother rose to her feet, panic etched across her face, as though every instinct in her body screamed to protect her son. But the boy, standing so small behind the towering podium, did not flinch. His hands clutched the documents, and his eyes, those clear, unblinking eyes, stared straight ahead. He raised his voice one final time, cutting through the chaos like a blade. This trial isn't about property anymore. It's about justice, and justice is watching. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the men in suits paused for a moment, taken aback by the child's courage. The gavel slipped from the judge's hand, clattering loudly onto the desk. The jury, pale and shaken, leaned forward as if compelled to listen. And in that silence, a truth settled in. The boy had gone too far to be silenced easily. His words were no longer confined to the courtroom. They were echoing into the minds of every person present. Seeds had been planted, seeds of doubt, of resistance, of change. But as the mother looked at her son and then at the men who had entered, she realized something chilling. Truth alone might not be enough to protect him. Because when you expose the powerful, they strike back. The storm was at its peak, and the final blow was yet to come. The silence that followed the boy's final words was suffocating. The walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see whether courage could survive the weight of corruption. The two suited men stood at the edge of the jury box, their presence heavy and deliberate, a warning carved into flesh. Their mission was clear: contain the boy, contain the truth. Yet something unexpected had happened. The very people who had been silent spectators were no longer passive. They had felt the tremor of his words, and now the entire room seemed to shift in his direction. The jurors, 12 ordinary citizens, who had once looked down at the boy with polite condescension, leaned forward. They had seen him dismantle a defense, team trained to bury truth under technicalities. They had seen him unravel a system that thrived on silence. And now, as they gazed at his scarless, childlike face, they recognized something. Frightening and undeniable: justice didn't always come from the powerful. Sometimes it came from the most unexpected voices. The judge, pale and sweating, adjusted his robe as though it was suffocating him. His eyes darted toward the suited men, searching for direction, but found none. For the first time in his long career, the gavel was useless. He was no longer in control. Then, like a wave crashing against a cliff, the courtroom erupted. The journalist in the back stood up, shouting for confirmation, his pen scratching furiously as he whispered to colleagues about cover-ups and systemic rot. The defense attorney scrambled, demanding mistrials and silencing orders. The prosecutor, red-faced, hurled accusations at the child's mother, as though a parent's love could explain away evidence. But none of it mattered anymore, because the jury had heard enough. The foreman, a woman who had been quiet through the entire proceeding, rose to her feet. Her hand shook slightly as she gripped the edge of the jury box. Then, with a voice that cracked but carried through the room, she said, "We have reached a verdict." The words cut through the chaos like steel. The judge stammered, tried to delay. But the juror's eyes bore into him with a force that left no room for denial. And so, reluctantly, he nodded. Proceed. The foreman's lips trembled as she spoke the decision. The accused, the corporation, the crooked hands behind the stolen property, the very machine that had mocked this family for daring to demand fairness, was declared guilty. Gasps echoed across the chamber. For the first time, the courtroom was not ruled by power, intimidation, or fear. It was ruled by truth. The boy lowered his papers, his small frame still dwarfed by the podium. His mother's hands covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she realized her son had done the impossible. But the true shock came next. The foreman did not sit. Instead, she looked directly at the boy. This child's testimony may not have been standard procedure, she said, her voice steadying with every word. But justice is not always found in procedure. Today, it was found in courage. The audience erupted, some in cheers, others in disbelief, but the shift was undeniable. Reporters rushed from the room, their voices racing to send the story into the world beyond those walls. Cameras outside the courthouse caught the roar of the crowd as the news spread like wildfire. An 8-year-old black boy had exposed corruption and swayed a jury in the face of intimidation. The suited men? They froze, realizing their presence had been turned into evidence of the very intimidation they were sent to enforce. Their retreat was quiet, shameful, almost invisible, but it was too late. The story had already escaped their grasp. As the mother pulled her son into her arms, she whispered something only he could hear, a promise that his gift, his mind, and his bravery would never again be dismissed as childish. And in that moment, the boy looked past her shoulder, past the jurors, past the reporters now flooding the aisles. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the seal of the court above the judge's head. Justice. For the first time in his young life, he believed it was possible. Not perfect, not permanent, but possible. And that belief, planted in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it, would ripple outward, through newspapers, through broadcasts, through whispered conversations in kitchens and classrooms, becoming a story too powerful to erase. The boy was only 8 years old, but that day, he had forced a nation to listen. And the world would never forget it.